everybody, and welcome to Live Lives, where we look at history through some of its own eyes. Today, we'll be looking at what the life of a legionnaire of the late Roman Republic might have looked like from his own perspective. For many reasons, I knew this is going to be the first episode I would be working on when I came up with the idea of a historical lives kind of deal. I've always been fascinated at how people who lived so long ago had such deep and complex lives and experiences, and I think that one of the biggest disappointments of historical records is that we rarely, if ever, hear the voices of people in old societies who weren't in a ruler or scribe class. A great example of this is the late Roman Republic legionnaire. While great masses of these highly disciplined soldiers carved a massive and oftentimes bloody path through history, most of our best understanding of their experiences comes from the generals or ranking officers that of course didn't share the same burdens, duties, and maybe even joys that some of the soldiers were prone to see. So in order to get a real sample of what one of these ancient soldiers really went through, we're going to be looking at the experiences of an admittedly made-up individual, hear me out here, to help frame and understand the real deal a bit better. While the man we'll be following isn't based on a real figure, the experiences and obstacles he might face were common and expected for any man of his station and in his era. The year our story begins is 75 BC. So our story has to start out with a name, doesn't it? The funny thing is that the Romans didn't give their babies names right away, because infant mortality unfortunately made even the child's parents a bit bleakly pragmatic about getting attached. Cold reception for mommy and daddy. But our new baby is either a tough or a lucky little scrapper, because he manages to live the 8 days required to earn a name and personhood. His proud parents, Severus and Lucia, make their decision, Marcus. His family are poor plebeians, but they do have something similar to a modern family name, Silvius. Marcus Silvius. Poorer Roman families like his didn't tend to have many members, influence, or connections, but after the Marian reforms, the old requirements for legionaries to own land in order to serve was thrown aside. This reformation brought the powerful and hardy Roman lower classes to the forefront of Rome's legions, and no war with Rome was ever the same again. Being brought up in Rome with a poor family wasn't some lavish experience. No one to feed you grapes in the reclining chair you didn't own. The Silvius family would find itself raising their new child in an insulae, or the Roman equivalent of an apartment. Poverty or other conditions often forced two families to share a single room, so nothing lavish for the up-and-coming Marcus. Once Marcus made it to age 1, however, he'd pass an important milestone and be eligible to become an official citizen of Rome. While his family was suffering from poverty, they made sure to go through the legal motions for their young boy. After all, even though Rome wasn't yet the legend of today, Roman citizenship afforded rights so beneficial that wars would be fought within Roman territory in the near future, just to secure it. I'd like to imagine our invented Roman, brought up as a typical but personable and good-hearted sort. Roman morals and conventions often fall way outside of what we modern peoples would consider acceptable, but Romans still had a deep respect for principled behavior and accountability, and even the dour, militaristic Roman mindset wasn't above a bit of childish humor. If you find yourself with the time, I'd recommend looking up Roman graffiti. From crude political cartoons to rude anatomical drawings, it's funny to think that this society so different and removed to our own was still drawing genitals on the bathroom walls. Roman youth would be free of concern for Marcus until age 8, with children this young being considered infants, or infantia. A poor and destitute family were the Silvii, but they would be gentle with their son until this age and see to it he was looked after and fed as best as they could manage. While the mother would be expected to do most of the parenting in these younger years, the father of a plebeian family in these conditions did everything he could to pull in money. Severus Silvius wasn't a fortunate man, but he didn't shirk his duties to his family either, providing for his son Marcus and his wife Lucia. Marriage in Rome was close to but not quite a match for our modern conception of the practice. Like in many older cultures, the head of the household, or even a wider clan for the patricians, was the oldest living male, known to the Romans as the paterfamilias. The paterfamilias had full legal control over his family and their estate, or what little estate there was to the Silvii. To a plebeian family like theirs, however, maintaining strict and rigid traditional hierarchy to keep up appearances and give an air of moral superiority was probably worthless, and in function would mean that the poor Lucia and Severus would work together and likely each be more involved in managing their shared lives, although Severus would have final authority over all debates. Not exactly a dynamic unique to the Romans in older days, but the legalistic aspect is unique if you ever look into it. Household dynamics aside, Marcus eventually would reach and pass his 8th birthday. At this point, his parents would make extensive use of Marcus to help maintain the house and get necessary chores done. For the Silvii, this wouldn't be done out of a cold utilitarianism, but purely out of necessity. It would already be hard enough to feed a young family in Severus's position, so it only makes sense to have the boy help out as much as he could to alleviate some of the financial pressure. It would go on and on like this for Marcus without very much reprieve or relief besides occasional outings with other poor boys his age. Rich Romans didn't tend to have an appreciation for the dirty poor people, and likely wouldn't want bad character traits from the plebs rubbing off onto their children. Marcus would end up getting into trouble very often with his friends, more a consequence of his social class and surroundings than of any real malicious nature. In his age group, boys like Marcus were almost expected to act up and out, and although refined Roman society was supposed to be above street brawls and mischief, there was almost a general acceptance and tolerance of this behavior from boys and young men up to a certain age. The same couldn't be said of girls and women to any degree, who were always expected to be submissive and modest, and to do otherwise would be scandalous. Not to say there weren't powerful and talented Roman women that came into play time and time again, but they generally had to take different routes to meet their ambitions. Finally, after having made it through a risky infancy, and having made it out of a troublesome time as a youth, our young Marcus would reach his 14th birthday, and in the eyes of Roman society this would mean he was now a man, or maybe something close to it. His father would set aside some money for the toga virilis, or the toga of manhood. Maybe a bit similar to a man buying his son his first suit today, this toga showed that Marcus was now a full Roman citizen, with all the responsibilities and freedoms that came with. Of course, at age 14, we'd all know Marcus hasn't really reached full maturity on a physical or mental level, but this symbolic piece of clothing would mean a lot to him, and he'd treasure it as long as he lived. Reminder of an old man and woman that wanted Marcus to succeed at whatever he did. Marcus would take pride in his newfound adulthood, and a life spent in the rougher part of Rome would be more than enough to grant him grit and confidence. Rich and high-born Romans tended to look down on people like Marcus, an uppity and bankrupt son of a nobody. Patricians didn't carry much love for the lower class, and the politics of the Republic were becoming more and more divisive throughout Marcus's life. There was something resembling a modern political two-party system at play, with the elitists and highborns, or optimates as they were called, and the lower classes and their high-born sponsors, known as the populares. Marcus loved Rome, but even the simplest man could see that Rome was bleeding itself dry, with the optimates doing whatever they could to further their own interests, and the populares sometimes pushing for sane and measured reforms, and sometimes pushing for whatever would win them the vote, so to speak. Marcus would, after some time, reach the age of 17. His options going forward in life were slim, his background considered. However, after the Marian reforms some decades before his birth, there was always military service. It was a daunting prospect. Marcus didn't fear war, and like most Romans, had a perhaps over-glorified view of the affair. But signing on as a legionary would mean he would essentially belong to the state for 25 years, at the very least. A bit longer than the usual tour of duty, huh? But it didn't look to Marcus like he had much choice. Slave away at hard physical labor for the rest of his days and barely scrape by? He didn't hold the choice against his parents, but Marcus couldn't bear the thought of coming to raise a family in the meager conditions he had known. So just like that, Marcus had made his mind up. Jarring as it would be for an independent man like himself, he traveled to the north of Italy and signed away the next 25 years of his life with the 11th Legion. They were being raised by the local Roman governor for some distant problem even further north, beyond Italy. This Roman governor was named Julius Caesar, and I wonder if Marcus still would have signed up if he knew what the next few years would look like. Would anyone have? The recruitment process was, somewhat unsurprisingly, similar to the standard affairs that we carry out in modern armies today. One thing you'll notice about the Roman military system is that even though the weapons and physics of the fighting are wholly different animals from modern warfare, the logistics, and to some degrees the strategy, line up with our modern militaries roughly 2,000 years later. So I guess you could say we're either very uncreative, or they set a good standard. All new recruits were judged physically and mentally. Recruiters would look for quick-moving and intelligent eyes, a tall and sturdy stature to bear equipment and fight, and made sure their recruits were Roman citizens with legal exams. Wouldn't want any Gauls getting in now, would we? Marcus would make it through his exam with relative ease. Physical fitness and a quick mind were valued greatly in Roman society, as in its military, so a lot who applied were already in good shape. This wouldn't make the legendary days-long forced marches a piece of cake, but they'd be doing enough drilling soon to make them even more resilient. Marching was, in fact, the first thing that the new soldiers were trained for. Carrying all of their weapons and armor on long, grueling walks now sort of took the bite out of doing it in hostile territory later, maybe. What came next would be weapons training. The standard weapon a legionary could expect to find himself with would be the gladius, or a short stabbing sword. This sword paired well with the massive defensive shield known as the scutum, that big red rectangle you'll see the Romans using in just about any movie. In a way, I'd argue that the shield was almost of more import to the Roman way of fighting at this time than the sword. Keeping formation and wearing down your enemy was top priority, and the Romans excelled at beating lesser-trained infantry this way, who rarely could compete with a solid and impregnable wall of heavy infantry. One of the most crucial parts of training would be discipline. Discipline was, in a sense, at the very core of the earlier Roman character throughout all arms of its society, and the military even more so. The formations and responsiveness of a legion's soldiers were paramount to their engagements. Fancy maneuvering and surprise attacks played important roles here and there, but very few foes at this time in the world could match the sheer rigid nature of a trained and armored formation of legionaries. This is probably why Rome's later civil wars were the most price-exacting, as their own finely tuned weapon system turned against itself. But by the end of his training, Marcus would be twice or more the fighter than he was before, not only because of his new skills, but because of how he could now function as his own cog in the massive Roman army. From the eye in the sky, a Roman army would be made up of legions first, huge organizations of men that were 5,000 strong when fully staffed. These could be broken down further into 10 cohorts of 480 men, and further still into 6 centuries of 80 men, and lastly, 10 contubernium of 8 men. The contubernium was essentially a modern squad unit, and teammates in a contubernium shared a tent, labor duties, and fought side by side within their larger century. In this way, the Roman army connected the single soldier in a direct line all the way to the army. Every man had his space to fill, and the general could more easily direct them. After 4 months of some of the most demanding drills, the legion's training would be complete. At this point, though they still hadn't seen a battle, the entirety of the 11th was ready for war. And it's a good thing they were, because Caesar had just that in mind. The Gauls to the far north had always been something of an enemy to the Romans, though not always in practice. The history of antagonism and war between Rome and Gaul stretched back centuries at this point in time, but Rome had changed over these centuries, while Gaul had stayed almost the same. Rome was no longer the weak, single city-state that it was so long ago, and commanded what could already be called a titanic landmass. Maybe confrontation with Gaul was inevitable. Maybe not. But the truth is, when Caesar saw the benefit he would reap from his conquest of Gaulish lands, the death warrant had already been signed, so to speak. Marcus would probably not be aware of the character of Caesar. Caesar had a marvelous way of winning his soldiers' love and support time and time again, and it would save his life and career many times. He was also the champion of the populares, the self-styled patrons of the poor masses. It is for this reason that when Caesar ordered his army to march north towards the border with Gaul, an army made mostly of plebs and poorer Romans, that his soldiers fell in lockstep. The problem, in truth, wasn't an invasion from Gaul or any of its tribes. What was really happening was that a single tribal group of Gauls, known as the Helvetii, were trying to migrate through Roman lands, supposedly to escape the predations of the Germans that lived across the Rhine. They set up something of a refugee camp on the banks of a river near the border, and pleaded with Caesar to help them. Caesar said he would need time to consider the offer. At this point, he had his armies erect massive fortifications on the river bank overnight. This was something that the legions were famous for. As part of their standard equipment, they all carried entrenching and construction tools. Marcus would break his back, working at top speed through the night to prepare this earthwork. While it might strike him as a strange reaction to the refugees, which had visibly come with their families and small children, the hate that most Romans felt for Gaul would likely ease any questions of purpose. When it became clear that the Romans weren't going to budge, the Helvetii finally broke camp and started to leave en masse. But like a predator, when Caesar saw an opportunity for profit, he took it, taking his legions and crossing the river. At this point, there was no going back. Caesar had set his mind towards Gaul, and whether or not he had a valid reason to invade would be just an afterthought for him by now. While Gaul wasn't much different than the Roman side of the border, it must have been an eerie thing for Marcus and the soldiers. Here they were, in the wooded heartland of their ancient enemy, marching deep into unknown territory. Would they be scared? Maybe excited? After all, war tends to be a profitable venture for the victor, and at this time a victorious Roman soldier could make a fortune in plunder and, unfortunately for their foes, the slave trade. It's hard to say what would be going through their minds, but they certainly didn't stop now. Thanks for listening to Part 1 of March of the Eagle. I hope you got some fun out of this little peek into what the day-to-day might have looked like for a legionary. It's been an interesting process developing my pilot episode, but I hope it was enjoyable and maybe told a story you liked and taught you something new. That's sort of the balance I'm trying to maintain with this ground-eye perspective on history, I suppose. If you've got any feedback or just want to say hey, we'd love to hear it at livelives.online. See you, folks.